On this slide are things that you might use if you decide this is a strategy we want to implement. And I'm doing this in terms of vocabulary. But this is a strategy that we want to use. And you meet with a group of teachers and you determine what is it that an observer would have to see in the classroom if they were observing for fidelity in implementation of this strategy. And they look at what they would need to see from a teacher and what actually they would need to see a student doing in the classroom. And then you would develop the probe based on answers to those questions. And everyone agrees, for this to be implemented with fidelity, the teacher needs to be doing this. And you might come up with 3 things. For everyone to agree on, for this to be implemented with fidelity, you would need to see the students doing these 3 things. Keep your probes short, quick, but powerful. How many of you have used some sort of a data monitoring probe in your school that you have created after discussions and collaboration? I'm sure there's several. Yeah.
And I know that you all are familiar with the assessment instruction cycle. You know that we have to begin with initial assessment, move to instructional design, instructional delivery, and then progress monitoring. Sam's been talking about progress monitoring this whole session. That's the CFA he's been talking about. On the next slide, we have some bullets under our assessment cycle for initial assessment and what we need to do, and progress monitoring, what we need to do. This is just a reminder of things that you need to make sure you are doing. We're not saying you're not doing it. We're not saying you're not doing it correctly. We're just reminding you that these are some things that you need to focus on.
And again, looking at the assessment instruction cycle with instructional design and instructional delivery, these are things that you can talk about as you're implementing a particular strategy and beginning to think about the instructional design of that strategy when you're collaborating with teachers, developing lesson plans and things of that nature, how you're going to do these things. And then instructional delivery, these are questions that teachers might want to use when they're developing a unit plan or a day plan, those kinds of things. Remember, assessment is moving from assessment of learning to assessment for learning to now assessment as learning is taking place in the classroom. How can you engage students during class to know where they are in the learning? You could use sticky notes. You could have students line up, I agree with this or I disagree with this. Get them actively involved in that assessment in the classroom as learning is taking place.
All right, again, Kathy asked earlier in the session, how many principals do we have in here? Raise your hand again. And as Kathy said, we're former principals. So you principals, do you have effective teachers in your building?
Do they all have strengths and weaknesses? Yes.
All right. This is just a reminder of what effective teachers do. And as you read over this list, you probably sit there and say to yourself, not out loud, ooh, Ms. Smith does a good job with organization and efficient learning environment. You know what goes on in your building. You know who has weaknesses. You know who has strengths. But this is just a reminder.
And that collaboration among teachers is what draws out what teachers are gifted at. And they should be available to share with other teachers what their gifts are in the learning. So that's why we talk about what effective teachers do. If you have never been to, write this down, www.cas.org. How many of you been to that site? www.cas.org. If you haven't been there, there are some powerful 5 or 6 minute video clips about universal design for learning. There's some that are actually in the classroom that you can show teachers that are actively engaged in the learning with students, and where students are actively engaged in making meaning of learning themselves. Those would be great. if I were a principal, I would be showing those kinds of things to my teachers and then say, all right, let's talk about this. And then you can talk about it in groups. How can we make our classroom more like this universal design for learning?
One thing that is on this list, and we need to look at talking about motivating students to participate in their own learning. We haven't brought this out, but you know, if you're successful, will you want to come back again and again? Or if all you ever see is failure? I've said in earlier sessions, if you told me to go out and run a 4-minute mile, I'd be up the creek. Probably when I was 16, I couldn't run a 4-minute mile. And every day at PE, my PE teacher said, Pat, you're going to go outside and run a 4-minute mile. Well, what would I start doing with PE? I'd start skipping it, wouldn't I? I'd start being sick that day I had PE. Do students do this when they are not engaged in a classroom? Do they find reasons to not go?
I think the greatest thing a teacher can do in a classroom with a group of students is to engage them in their own learning in such a fashion that they want to come back and try it again, so that the teacher can make it more difficult the next time and they're still wanting to try it again. So that's self-efficacy. They have to experience some successes along the way to keep that shoulder pressed up against the grindstone to get at the rigor. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about there.
I don't know that there is a magic bullet out there. I think that we have to have a systematic approach to things. We have to make sure that our teachers are doing things. So if all of our teachers engaged our students in a meaningful manner, would we eliminate many of our problems? Do we blame the students?
In the general session this morning, I think that myth was put to rest with what was shared there. We want you to take a few minutes, the last few minutes that we have in the room, and look at the first 2 questions with your school team and begin to discuss what your focus might be this year, some things you want to refine, some things that you might want to institute. But begin that discussion with your school team. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope we've given you something to think about and some processes that you might use in your school.